Hi there, hope you're doing alright. In today's video we're going to go over creating 3 nodes in EVE-NG. So it's going to be a Windows 10 node, a Linux node, and then an OpnSense node. These are the steps we will follow in order to do so. Okay, step 1, we need to download the ISOs. So I've done that already. So I've downloaded the Windows 10 ISO from Microsoft, Debian from Debian's website, and the OpnSense from the OpnSense website. I've saved them in my downloads folder. Okay, the second step is to create the folder for each node. So what we're going to do is SSH into the EVE-NG server. So in this case the IP is 10.0.0.9. Okay, so we need to make the following directories. The third step is to copy the ISOs to those folders. So for that I'm just going to use SCP within the terminal. Okay, so the first one we will do the OpnSense. So in my downloads folder is the ISO image. Then I'm going to do space, and then we're going to do root at, and then the server IP address, colon, and then the location. So we're going to do the location that we created in the previous step. Now what's very important is that we need to rename the ISO to cd-rom.iso. This is what is needed for EVE-NG to know what ISO to boot when starting a node. We can press enter and it will copy. Depending on the size of the ISO, it can take a long time. So we will repeat the step for the Linux one. So the location of the ISO in my downloads folder, again root at, and then the IP address of the server, the folder that we created in the previous steps, and then we'll rename it to cd-rom.iso. We'll do it again for the Windows ISO. So again, the ISO in the downloads folder, root, the IP address of the server, colon, and then the location we want the ISO to go to. Yeah, so once it's done, so I'm going to cd into the base folder. So it's /opt/unetlab/addons and then /qmu. From there, I'm just going to ls into each folder just to make sure that the CD or the ISO has been copied to those folders. And we can see each folder did have a cd-rom.iso file in it, so we should be good to go. The next step is to create the virtual hard drives. So I'm going to cd into the OpnSense folder. What we're going to do is create a QCOW2 disk, and the naming is very important. So it has to be that virt ioa.qcow2, and then the size 10 gigs will be enough for OpnSense. I'm going to push enter and it's created. I'm going to cd out, then I'm going to cd into the next one. So we'll do the Linux one. So we'll do the exact same thing, but for Linux I recommend a 30 gig hard drive. So I'm going to change the 10 to the 30, press enter. We can just check that it created, and then we'll cd out again, cd into the next one. So it will be the Windows folder. And we will repeat it. For this they recommend 60 gigs. We can just double check again by doing ls in each folder and just making sure all of them have the ISO and the hard drive. Okay, from there we can log into our EVNG instance. Just make sure, and it's very important, to choose the HTML5 console. This way we can use or access all the nodes directly in our web browser. We don't need external software. So I'm going to create a lab called init. Once created, we need to create a WAN network. This will give our nodes access to the internet so we can do things like updates or anything we need to do to get the operating systems installed and up to date. So I'm going to choose the first cloud type, so cloud 0, and I'm going to call it WAN. Okay, now the next step is to add all the nodes. So if we go to add a new node and we scroll down, we'll see that now the Linux, the OpnSense and the Windows will be blue, and we'll be able to select them or add them. So the first one we'll add will be the Linux or the Debian 12 one. From there you can change settings if you want. So if you want to give it more CPUs or anything, I'm going to leave it like this, it's fine. I'm going to then drag the plug icon to the WAN. This will connect the node to the internet. I'm going to repeat this step for the other two. So for the OpnSense, you can increase the parameters if you need, or change them. Connect it to the WAN. And now for the Windows node, I'm going to give it more CPUs, so we'll give it example 3. Everything else is fine. And for this one, I'm not going to connect it to the WAN yet. Main reason is when you install Windows, if it detects internet, it's going to try to force you to log in using a Microsoft account. We don't want to do that, so I'll leave it off during the initial installation step. Okay, so we'll start by starting the Linux node. So we'll click on it and choose start. Once it is started, you can click on it and it will open a new tab where we can interact with it. So I'm going to choose graphical install. So you can fill it out as needed. Just a note, there was quirks while installing it. So one, the console would go black, so I couldn't see anything. So clicking and dragging would slowly add the interface back. But overall, the best thing to do is just to let it be and it slowly sorts itself out. So you can also try close and open it, reopen it. It didn't really do much. It was just leave it, and as it needs to, it will fix itself. Okay, the next thing we need to do is when we get to the stage where it tells us to reboot, we need to SSH back into the server, and we need to remove the ISO. Otherwise, when the node reboots, it's going to boot from the ISO again. So I'm going to cd to the Linux folder, and then we're going to do rm and then space -f space and the cd-rom ISO. This will remove the ISO. So if we do an ls, we should only see the virtual hard drive. Once that is done, we can then click continue and then it will reboot. Now when it reboots, it will reboot from the hard drive and we should be good to go. So the next thing to do is to update it. Since this Debian image is the internet one, so in other words, when it installs, it will download all the latest and newest packages and install it. I don't need to go and manually update it again. So we can now just shut it down to turn off the node. Okay, now we're ready to move on to the next one. So we'll repeat this step for the OpnSense node. So we'll click on it and choose start. Once it is started, so you see the play icon, we can then click on it to open the console. So again, it will open a new tab, and you can follow the steps to install it. Once it gets to the stage where it's asking you to reboot, once again we will go to that folder and we'll remove the ISO from it. Once the ISO is removed, we can then go and reboot it. Once it's rebooted, we can do the initial setups of OpnSense. So you can see that the LAN is incorrect, the LAN and WAN. So our WAN is on the VTNet 0 interface. So we're going to log in, and then once we logged in, we're going to type 1 to assign the interfaces. I'm going to choose no, no. So for the WAN, I'm going to type VTNet 0. And then for the LAN, I'm going to type VTNet 1. And then enter to finish. I'll push Y to accept it. Okay, so now we can see that it is correct. So the WAN is now getting DHCP from the WAN interface, and then the LAN has created its own 1.1 network. We can type in the 10.0.0.18 to see if we can access the web UI for OpnSense. Okay, as you can see, we don't have access to it because by default the firewall rules in OpnSense don't allow you to access it on the WAN interface. So we'll type in 8 to get to the shell, and then we'll type in the following to disable the firewalls. So we'll type pfctl space and then -d. This will disable it. From there, if we go back, we should now be able to access the web UI via the WAN interface. I will log in and we can run the setup wizard to do the initial setup. Now if we click reload, it won't allow us back into the web UI again, so it will just time out. So what we need to do is go back into the OpnSense console and then disable the firewall again. So once it's disabled and we go back to the web UI, it should allow us back in. Okay, if you want to do it this way for your future labs, you can go under firewall, and then under the WAN rules, you can just create a WAN rule to allow port 80 or 443 to access this firewall. That will allow you to access the web UI from the WAN connection. But since I'm going to be using a different method in most of the labs, so instead I'm going to connect, for example, a Debian or Linux host into the LAN of the OpnSense. I will then access the web UI that way instead of creating WAN firewalls. Okay, once we're done, we can turn it off. From there we can move on to the Windows node. So I'll click on it and start. Once it's started, you can click on it to open the console. You can then just follow these steps. Once you get to the part where we need to select a hard drive, you'll see it doesn't show up. So we can click load drivers. We can click on the browse button at the bottom. Then we'll go under the B drive, the storage folder, the 2003 R2 folder, and then in this case 64, the AMD 64 folder, and click OK. This will find 3 drivers we can use. We can just install the first one. So this will install the Vert.io SCSI controller, and that should now allow us to see the hard drive and continue the installation. While it's installing, I recommend just going back into the server and CD into the Windows folder, and then be prepared to remove the ISO. Once the installation gets to the restart stage, we can remove the ISO. This way when Windows restarts, it will not boot into the ISO. Yeah, once we've booted into Windows, I'm going to shut it down. Once it is shut down, I'm going to connect it back to the WAN. We will then turn it on and boot into the node again. Once we boot it into the node, I'm going to run all the updates. It is important to try to get it as up to date before we commit the nodes. If you don't do this, when you create a new node or an instance of a node, it's obviously going to boot up that node, and it will then go and, for example, start downloading the drivers and updates and doing all of that every single time. So it's best to have it as up to date as possible, so when you create instances of a node in the future, you don't have all of that wasting your bandwidth and resources updating itself. Okay, so I've done all the updates and I've booted into it and I'm happy. I can then go and shut it down. Okay, so the last thing to really do is tell EVE-NG that we want to commit the current state of the node to be the default state when we create any new nodes in the future, using any instance of the nodes in the future. So what we need to do is go to lab details and get the ID of the project. We'll then SSH back into the server. Okay, once we're in the server, we need to CD into the project folder. So it will be under opt, unit lab, temp, and then 0. 0 just means it's the default user. And then in there, if we do an ls, you'll see that our project folder is in there. So we'll cd into that. Now if we do another ls, we'll see the folders 1, 2, and 3. Those correspond to the nodes. So for example, the first node we created is Linux. That will be in the first folder, OpnSense second, and Windows the third folder. So what we'll do is cd into each folder and we will commit that hard drive. So then EVE-NG will then use that hard drive as the default hard drive to use for that node. So we're going to cd into the first folder, and then we're going to type the following command. If we push enter, it will start committing that hard drive. Please note that this can take a bit of time. Okay, so we'll cd out of that folder and into the second one. And we'll repeat the command. Then we'll do the same for the third folder. And we'll commit that image. EvenG recommends, so in their manuals, once you create a commit, they recommend to just fix all file permissions. Just run this to make sure all file permissions are correct. As an optional step, they recommend you can compress the bigger hard drives by doing the following. So for example, since the Windows 10 hard drive is big, the virtual drive is big, you can compress it. So you'll do the virt sparsify and then compress, and then we tell it to compress the original hard drive. It will then make another hard drive called compressed virt IOA. Once the compression is done, we then need to rename it. So we'll rename the original one. I'll just do a -O. If I do an ls, we should see now we have the compressed and the original. Now we need to rename the compressed version to the virt IOA. So we can go now and delete all the nodes since we're done. I'll re-add the Windows node, and that will boot using that compressed hard drive. So after compressing the hard drive, I couldn't get Windows to boot. So I tried it twice and both times it failed. So what I did is I reverted back to the original hard drive. So I'm just going to delete that hard drive. So the virt IOA. And then once it's deleted, I'm going to rename the backup that we had. And then I will recreate the node and then reboot it. And this time Windows 10 boots up no problem. I want to thank you for watching. If this video helped you, please like and subscribe. I would appreciate it. It will grow the channel. In the next videos we'll do some labs. I want to do a few OpnSense point-to-point labs. And until then, I'll see you in the next one.